Sí, pero yo no voy a matar como siempre, porque recuérdate que hoy es
Hello.
Shalom.
hoy es jueves.
Hi, how's the day?
All right. Just giving it a second for other people to log in.
Okay.
A few here. We've got a few on the YouTube. Just give it another minute. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, let's go ahead and get down to our studying. Thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon and for being here to do a little bit more Torah study as we try to do each and every week. We had a bit of a week off. If anybody is confused by the Torah portions, just a little bit about how the calendar works in Judaism. So, as you may or may not know, if you live in the land of Israel, you celebrate only one day of each of the major holidays. So, for example, the holiday of Shavuot would have been celebrated only last Thursday night and Friday. That meant that if you lived in Israel, you would have read Parashat Naso, the Torah portion for this week, last week. But if you live outside of Israel, then you celebrate holidays for 2 weeks. And that means that the second day of Shavuot, which was celebrated here in the United States, was on Saturday. That means we had the Torah reading for Shavuot on Saturday, rather than the Torah reading for the actual Torah portion. So now we are a week behind Israel, if you will. And that means that we are going to play catch up for a while until a little bit later on in the summer. But don't be confused. If you go to heapcal.org, check out, make sure you're doing the Torah portions for outside of Israel, and you'll stay on the right calendar. Sorry, there's something stuck in my throat today. But that means that we are indeed on Parashat Naso. And don't worry, we're not behind. We will still cover all the Torah portions we are supposed to cover. We are going to start off our discussion of this Torah portion in chapter 5. We are in the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, and we are continuing with some of the last minute instructions that are going into our leaving. Now, I should point out there is some debate and discussion among the classic commentators and the early sages of where exactly some of these instructions were given, whether they were given before the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, whether they were given after, whether they were given in the first year or the second year. That's not germane to our discussion today, but it's just a nice thing to keep in the back of your mind that traditionally we do not try to always line everything up on a timeline according to the Torah portion order, but instead recognize that different parts of the Torah are being retold as they are needed by the reader, not necessarily in the chronology of when they were first said in the ancient world. Also, a technical side, I have the notes from the YouTube over on a second screen. I'm trying that out today, but if you see me keep looking to the left, it's because I'm still checking for the notes from YouTube. And if you're on YouTube and it seems like I'm taking longer than ever to look over there and find you and whatever you've typed, I apologize. But we'll see whether this works. It keeps the main screen a little bit less cluttered and easier to read. So let's get down to work. We are starting in chapter 5 of the book of Bamidbar, which is not the beginning of Naso, but is a piece that I think has some very interesting and timely discussions for us. So we begin with verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Instruct the Israelites to remove from camp anyone with an eruption or discharge and anyone defiled by a corpse. Remove male and female alike. Put them outside the camp so that they do not defile the camp of those in whose midst I dwell." The Israelites did so, putting them outside the camp as the Lord had spoken to Moses, so the Israelites did. Okay, so we start off with a topic that most people either know little about or don't want to know any more about, which is to say that there are certain cases where somebody will have a cause of ritual impurity, and there is a time of quarantine. Now, it seems like quarantine is the topic of much recent conversation, but I want to point out that the quarantine here is not a quarantine where we believe other people are a danger to each other. This is a quarantine only to prevent the improper transmission of ritual impurity. As we have discussed many times before in previous classes in previous years, the idea of being a tsarua, of being somebody who has tsara'at, the skin condition that's often called leprosy in some translations, although really quite misleading in my opinion, since it is not a medical condition. This was a condition that would often make it, would make it impossible for a person to bring sacrifices, and they had to go through a period of introspection. A zav, on the other hand, is somebody who has what is colloquially called in the translator vernacular a discharge. That means that something has come out of their reproductive organs in a manner that it is not supposed to, or in a manner that it's supposed to, but still rendering temporarily ritually impure. And then from somebody that is ritually impure because of a corpse, this is somebody who has taken care of the bodies of the deceased, which is, of course, a great, great mitzvah and deed for them to do. But it does render them ritually impure. As we're going to see when we get to our commentary, these three different types of ritual impurity actually have three different camps that are being discussed. I know it may sound like this is all one size fits all, but there is much more granularity when you compare this verse with other verses, especially in Vayikra. So we'll loop back on this idea when we get to our commentaries. But just know that the idea of ritual impurity is something that is not a blanket term, and that quarantine in the biblical sense for these ritual impurity issues was not a health regulation, but was instead simply part of the spiritual process of having a person go through different stages of response to different conditions. Before we press on to the next part of this chapter, any questions on that?
No.
Okay.
Yes, okay.
All right. We'll just give 1 second for YouTube to catch up, because it's going to seem like an abrupt topic change when I scroll down. And moving on. Still feel free to put in more notes in YouTube, folks, but I'll circle back. I just don't want to leave too much dead time. So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, seemingly introducing a new topic, "Speak to the Israelites. When a man or woman commits any wrong toward a fellow man, thus breaking faith with the Lord, and that person realizes his guilt, he shall confess the wrong that he has done. He shall make restitution in the principal amount and add 1/5 to it, giving it to him whom he has wronged." So there are a number of different aspects that are happening here, and we'll go into much more detail on this portion in our commentaries. But just for the moment, recognize the basic topic that is being outlined here. That when a person, and very explicitly a man or a woman, commits a sin, when they commit a transgression, and they do it to a fellow human being. I should point out in the Hebrew, perhaps I can actually point in this. You'll see that it's ish and isha, the classic Hebrew words for man and woman. When they commit a wrong towards an Adam, you'll notice that even though the translation uses the word man, woman, and man, really it should be more accurately translated as man, woman, or human. Adam being a reference to Adam Rishon, the first person, which is a reference to all of humanity, not just to one particular gender of humanity. So that idea here is that if a man or a woman commit a wrong to any other person, then not only have they committed a wrong, but they have done something of a breaking of faith with God. This idea of lim'ol ma'al is a little bit unusual, but somehow the wrong that they have done to another person is also a wrong done to God. But then they come to confess, to realize this guilt, and they want to acknowledge that guilt. You'll notice the Hebrew word ashma, which is, of course, the same root as the word ashamnu, which you may be more familiar with from our Yom Kippur services, when we go through an alphabetical acrostic of all of the different ways that we have transgressed and rebelled against God. So when you realize that you've done this, when you are confessing your guilt, you have to say very clearly what you have done, vidui, and you have to make restitution, right? A confession of a guilt, for example, if you have robbed someone, means very little if you do not return that which you stole. So if I steal $500 from you, and then I say, oh, you know what? I'm sorry, and I'm sorry, God, I really shouldn't have done that. I know that I was wrong, and the $500 stays in my pocket. I have not actually done confession. I have not actually done teshuvah. I've not repented from what the act I've committed, because I'm still keeping the spoils that I have stolen. So I have to give it back. And as a punishment, when I am forced to give it back according to the court and witnesses that are brought against me, I have to do so with a 20% surcharge. So if I stole $100 and then the court convicts me of that, I have to give back $120 as my penalty. Everyone with me so far?
Yes, I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes.
And I know you're probably going to teach us a little more about this particular subject, but eventually, if you could answer, how does that apply to us nowadays? You know, how do we make restitution, you know, the modern way of what rabbis believe that, you know, it should be done? Later on, when you finish, then you could answer that for me. That would be great.
No, that's great, because we're going to get into a bit more of a specific sub-case in just a second. So the general case is, it's good to ask that question now. So how do we modernize this, or how do we apply this in the modern world? The short answer is we don't, in a literal legal sense. That is to say that if somebody is stealing and they are caught by the civil police, and they are taken before a civil court and they are given a civil penalty, then they have, when they comply with it, follow to the law of the land, and that is considered to be sufficient. However, in general, if a person has committed a crime, made a sin, and they recognize the error before it's gone to a court or any other level of adjudication, then the rest does apply, meaning that you should return what you have stolen, or you should right your wrong, and you should confess what you have done as being wrong, and make an effort to avoid doing so in the next, in your next instance. So the prosecution of this is handled by the civil authorities, but if it doesn't reach the level of prosecution because you repent voluntarily before that, then it can be handled privately by you and whoever it is you wronged. And I should point out that that is the case in the ancient world as well, that if you stole 500 shekels from somebody in the ancient world, and then you recognized you had done wrong, and you hadn't been convicted, there were no witnesses, there was no way to tie it to you, but the guilt weighed on you, so you brought yourself back to the person you had stolen from, you would give them the 500 shekels back. You wouldn't have to give them the penalty on top of it. You would just return what you had taken.
Does that only apply for property? Is that also applied to hurting a person's feelings, or, you know, embarrassing them or something like that?
Yes, the penalty of the 20% applies when there is a loss. So, for example, if you had slandered somebody and hurt their business, then the court could assess a 20% penalty in addition to whatever base loss you had caused, and that could be done. So if you were to embarrass a person and now they couldn't do a performance that they were going to get paid for, then that would be something that would be assessed. But if you hurt someone's feeling in a way that doesn't cause a financial loss or anything that can be quantified, a person does still need to approach their victim and apologize directly and do what they can to make amends. So if they insulted them in front of a large crowd, if they insulted them in a way that became public knowledge, then they need to work hard to make sure that others realize that what they had said was inappropriate.
Gosh, Rabbi, if we all would do that, I think we would definitely have a better world.
And even better, if we all recognize that we would do that, we'd probably keep our tongue a little bit
Yes, you're right.
in the first place.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we end up on verse 8 with a very special special case. If the man has no kinsman to whom restitution can be made, that is to say, if the person you need to give your restitution to is no longer alive, and there's no relatives that you can actually find who would be the appropriate heir for what you are trying to return, the amount shall be repaid to the Lord. The amount repaid shall go to the Lord for the priest, for the Kohen, in addition to the ram of expiation, meaning the sacrifice that you would bring, with which expiation is made on his behalf. So basically, the vanilla circumstance would be Mr. A wrongs Mr. B. Mr. A realizes his mistake or has been forced by the court to recognize his mistake, and then returns the damage he had done to Mr. B. And if it was forced by the court, it would be a 20% surcharge. And in either case, there would also be, in the case of the force of the court, there would also need to be a sacrifice. But if Mr. B is no longer with us, and Mr. B has no relatives who could receive what it is that I am trying to return, my restitution, then what I need to return goes to the Kohen who is helping me with the sacrifice instead. This is a way of avoiding somebody thinking, oh, well, if I just kill the guy, then even if I get caught, I don't have to return the money. No, you're not allowed to keep anything that was taken. Ill-gotten gains don't get to stick with you. And then there's a reminder of a general principle about the Kohanim. So too, any gift among the sacred donations that the Israelites offer shall be the priest. They belong to the Kohen who helps officiate. This was part of the compensation for the priests. Remember, they did not receive land, which was the main means of producing wealth to survive with. And so receiving the monetary or meaty gifts, the sacrificial gifts that were brought, and when it was your turn to be the Kohen, you're the one who got it. This was a major part of how the Kohanim were maintained by the community. Okay, so that's our basic topic. Interestingly enough, if you go and check in the book of Kings, you'll see the wonderful story of Jehoiada and the issue of the Kohanim not using the money that was brought to the temple well, and instituting a new procedure for ensuring that the resources of the community supported the Kohanim, but also supported the basic building maintenance of the temple. All right, so let's take a look at some of our commentary. We are going to look for that one. All right. I think I can zoom in one more shot. I think people like when the text is as large as possible. That's a little bit too much. Hold on a second. That will still fit with my other bits on the screen. And let's go back to our topic about the different camps. That is to say, about the three categories of ritual impurity that were mentioned in the first section that we read. The reference is to the camp of the Shekhinah, meaning the sacred domain of the tabernacle and its courtyard. Okay, so wait a minute. What do you mean by camp? Well, according to the rabbis, there were three camps, and they were mutually inclusive as an expanding Venn diagram. That is to say, hold on a second. I think I can actually draw one perk because you don't have to look at my scribbles on the board. All right, so you have the tabernacle, which was in the center of the entire camp of the Israelites. And that was the holy section where the tabernacle and the altar and its courtyard were all held. And then, you know what, we can even change color easily. And then around that, there was the camp of the Levites. And then around that, hold on, work with me. there was the entire camp of Israel. So those are the three camps that we're going to be talking about in this discussion. So there were three categories of ritual impurity, each of which required a minimum of 7 days before it could be purified, right? So there are three categories. They each take 7 days to be purified. They each talk about being removed from the camp. But as we're going to see, they each have their own variations. They were a person afflicted with the skin disorder known as sara'at, a person suffering from emissions, the discharges from the reproductive organs, and a person who contracted impurity through contact with a corpse. All right, so those were the three that we talked about just a few minutes ago. The first named category, that is to say, the person who has sara'at, who has the condition often translated as leprosy, was expelled from all three camps. That means they ended up, just a second, they ended up outside, right? I don't know if you can see that little TZ I put over there, right, for Tzara'at. That's where they are staying. They are completely outside the camp altogether. Because the Torah spells this out in Leviticus 13, when it says, he shall dwell apart, his dwelling shall be outside the camp. There, the word camp means the camp of the Israelites. The person suffering from emissions, however, needs to keep out of the inner two camps, the camp of the Levites. So if you have emissions, if you have a discharge, then you are still within the tent, the camps where the tents of the Israelites were, where all the regular tribes and people hung out, but you were not allowed to go into either the Levite zone or into the main zone of the tabernacle. Of course, you couldn't go into the main zone anyway unless you were an actual Kohen. The person suffering from the two camps, the Levites, and of course the camp of the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah camp is considered to be the camp of the temple, the camp of the tabernacle at this point in our history. This is based on an interpretation by the Talmud in Pesachim 68. You can look it up there for more detail. Concerning someone who had a nocturnal emission, including marital intercourse, meaning the normal intimacy between husband and wife, but whose emissions are not beyond his control, meaning it wasn't a disease or some other problem that was causing a leakage that wasn't expected as part of just normal life. The relevant verse is found in Deuteronomy 23. If anyone among you is rendered unclean by nocturnal emission, he must leave the camp, and he must not re-enter the camp. Toward evening, he shall immerse himself in a ritual bath, and at sundown, he may re-enter the camp. The camp such a person must leave is the camp of the Levites. Again, the full explanation of that is found in the Talmud in Pesachim 68. Lastly, if someone became ritually impure through contact with a dead person, he must leave the camp of the Shekhinah, but may move freely in either of the other two camps. So that means you would technically be allowed into the Levite zone, but you would not be allowed into the actual zone of the tabernacle. So 3 camps, 3 different responses for 3 different types of ritual impurity. And this is just one of the very many ways that our sages tried to draw our attention to subtle changes in the wording and explanation of the mitzvot and how they all help to inform each other, that there is not a one-size-fits-all answer to how to deal with problems, even when they look similar. Very often, I think as we all are well aware in our modern life, people like to always act like they have the answer as though there was only one question. But in fact, even things that look very similar often require very subtle understanding of the difference between one and the other. And if you try to apply the same rule to all 3 of these, then at least 2 of them are going to be wrong. Now, you might be thinking, but why not just do the tzara'at? Why not just use the strictest interpretation for all forms of impurity? Whether it's tzara'at, whether it's a zav, whether it's tumat mate, whether it's any of the 3 categories we've talked about, just put everyone outside the camp, right? Just stick them all out there. That way, we're sure. Well, because the Torah, and by extension, the rabbis who came later to help us understand it, were not willing to add additional stringencies that the Torah did not demand. To take away a person's right to be in the camp, or a person's right to enter into the zone of the Levites unnecessarily would be a violation of, in the modern parlance, a violation of their rights. Just because you think it might be safer, just because you think it might be easier, just because you think, well, it's not doing any harm to the rest of us if we just shove them all out there. Well, no, because taking away what was their God-given right to be in the camp or to be in the zone of the Levites for the type of impurity they had, just to make your life easier, or just to avoid the difficulty of having to remember 3 things rather than 1, is simply not appropriate. The Torah is meant to fit each life like a glove, not like a sack. And therefore, we have to make sure that we are looking at all the details to make sure that it fits precisely the circumstances that we are dealing with. Any questions before I erase our map and move on? Not hearing anything?
That's okay. That's okay.
Okay. All right. Don't think I'm going to need to draw again, so I'm going to go back to regular mouse mode and scroll on down. All right. So when we were talking about you've harmed another person and you return with restitution, the 20% surcharge and all of that, the rabbis make a very interesting analysis of this. They say, and this is a summary by Chizkuni, but it's found in all the commentaries, this passage concerns the theft committed against the estate of a convert. The rabbis derive this from the words, a trespass against the Lord. Seeing that the convert left behind no heirs, the thief or robber considered what he did as finders keepers. All right, so it may have been stirring in the back of your mind when we were talking about returning the restitution to the closest heir, but if you couldn't find the heir, returning it to God via the Kohen, that how would it be possible that there wasn't an heir? I mean, we've talked about inheritance from time to time, and I've tried to make it clear that there is always somebody that is related to everybody, meaning that if you especially thought of this as being the time when we were in the camp around the Mishkan at the foot of Mount Sinai, we were all organized by family. We were all organized by clan. We had just had a census and knew who everybody was, for crying out loud. How can I not find a relative? Even if I have to go find an 8th cousin, they're going to be a relative. There is somebody related to everybody within the camp, except legally somebody who converted. That is to say, a 1st-generation convert. Legally, a convert, when they convert, is no longer considered to be a member of the family from which they came. Now, this was very, very important in the ancient world, where the families from which they came were idolaters. And it would mean that the idolaters, excuse me, really need to make sure that's off before I start class next time. It would mean that the family of the idolaters would then be able to inherit whatever the convert had gained within the people and land of Israel. And obviously that would be quite untenable, simply because idolatry was such an infection in that time. So legally, a convert was not considered to have any heirs. Now, if they had children, there's not an issue, right? Once they have children, their children are their heirs, and everything follows the normal pattern. But prior to having children, when they have converted, they now have no heirs, which means somebody who stole from a convert while the convert was alive and kept it until the convert died can't then say, well, he's got no heirs, and since generally it's first come, first served to his property, I just served myself a little early, right? So I took some of his stuff before he died. It could have been mine anyway once he died, so there's no crime, right? No, because you have committed a crime against God, not only against the human being, not only against the convert. And so therefore, you cannot just say, hey, finders keepers, it's mine. right? The Torah teaches that it is not so, but that the Lord is the one who considers himself as having been sinned against in this instance, right? Even though there is no living victim, there is still God who has been victimized by your crime. A similar paragraph in Leviticus 5 has the words, and he denies having trespassed against his colleague, speaking of a natural-born Jew. The reason why this paragraph follows that of the various types of ritual defilement is to remind us that this very defilement and the subsequent ostracism for at least 7 days was a punishment for a trespass committed, meaning that it was not uncommon within the rabbinic interpretation to think that some of the issues, most notably the issue of tzara'at, the skin affliction, came about because of hidden crimes that a person would commit. And during the times of hyper holiness in the ancient world, those hidden crimes would not stay hidden, but would manifest them through the skin of the criminal. And so this would then be saying he has been separated. We don't know what crime he committed, but he knows. He reflects on the crime that he has committed, and now he re-enters the camp willing to confess and willing to make restitution. And in this particular case, because there was no one alive to take it, the restitution goes to the Kohen.
Okay.
Is everyone following how these two pieces fit together according to Chizkuni and the Midrash that he's based on?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, the restitution should be to the Kohen, and then you answered as quickly as I was going to answer. That's good. Thanks.
You're on the right page, exactly. So the restitution goes to the Kohen because the Kohen, basically God inherits, and then God gives it to the Kohen. So there's a small detour of the property ownership from the original owner, held by the criminal, ownership transferred to God, and then from God transferred to the Kohen. All right, but we're not, come on, Mouse, we're not done with this topic yet, right? Because this whole idea of confession, of this idea of being outside the camp, of recognizing one's wrong, of returning and wanting to fix that wrong, this is teaching us a great deal about our mistakes in general, not only about this specific case. And that soul shall be guilty and confess. Rabbi Natan claims that this is in line, that this is a line that can be used universally for all such trespasses. That the first step in rehabilitation of the sinner must be his confession of having committed his trespass. Now that may sound obvious, right? I mean, you can't do tshuva, you can't repent unless you actually say what you did. But the fact of the matter is, many people try to apologize, try to fix the problem without ever actually admitting that what they did was wrong, without ever actually admitting that they made a mistake. They will admit that they are unhappy with the consequences. They'll admit that that they didn't think this is what was going to happen, that it was a surprise that this was the consequence. But to get somebody to actually say, you know what, I shouldn't have taken it in the first place. Not just, oh, I see how important this is to you, so I need to give it back to you. Or if only I had known, or I don't know what I was thinking, I just was being silly. Like, you have to actually say, I chose to do it. It was wrong. I shouldn't have done it. Because otherwise, you're setting yourself up to continue the cycle of excuses for future mistakes, for future sins. You have to actually admit what I did at the time I did it was wrong, and there's no excuse for why I did it. I can talk about circumstances and understand those in order to avoid being in those circumstances later if that is something that is my own problem. Much like somebody who crashes into a car while they're drunk, absolutely can say, well, I was drunk. That doesn't mean they didn't commit the crime. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be fully responsible for the crime. It just means they need to change their relationship with alcohol when they are planning to get behind the wheel of a car. So that aspect of recognizing the mistake that you made, of recognizing it as a mistake, is very much the foundation for how Judaism understands tshuva at all. And this is very, very important. Individuals, communities, even nations sometimes will not want to admit that they have ever made mistakes. They will try and say, at the time when that happened, it wasn't what we wanted. It wasn't what we thought. We did the best we could. No, admit a mistake and then see how you can fix the consequences that have come from that mistake. Continuing on that theme, we move into a selection from Sefer HaChinuch. We are commanded to confess before God our sins that we have sinned at such time that we feel remorse for them, right? You have to feel remorse first. You have to actually regret the deed, not the punishment that's coming at you, not the consequences that are coming at you. You can regret those too, but first and foremost, remorse that you did it at all. And this is the content of the confession. To say at the time of repentance, please God, I have sinned, I have transgressed, I have rebelled in such and such, meaning to say that he mentioned the sin that he did explicitly with his mouth, right? You don't just say, I've been bad. You say, I ran over your dog. I called you horrible names that I had no business saying and should never have even let get past my mouth. I stole $500 from your wallet. You have to say exactly what you did, not just I made mistakes. He should then seek atonement for it and extend his words in this matter according to his fluency, meaning that if a person is normally capable of being very expressive and very detailed in how they speak, then they should use that same level of expression and detail when confessing and admitting their mistakes. It's, if somebody is normally a great, eloquent speaker and they say, I'm sorry, I took your money. No. You can do better when you're talking about what you had for breakfast. You need to use the same level of description when talking about this. And on the other hand, if a person is normally of few words and simple expression, then by all means, they can express themselves with few words and simply when it comes time for this confession. And they, may their memory be blessed, meaning the sages, said that even sins that require the bringing of a sin offering still demand confession with the offering. And about this, that it states in Book of Numbers, our own verse, speak to the children of Israel, saying, a man or woman who commits any of these sins of man and rebels against the Lord, the soul is guilty and they shall confess the sins they did, right? They need to actually confess in addition to bringing a sacrifice. The sages said in Mechilta, since it says confess the sin from Leviticus 5, it means that the sin must be extant and that the sin offering, that the sin offering is alive and not slaughtered. This means the animal to be offered must still be alive, meaning before you make your confession. You don't bring an offering, have it slaughtered, and then a year later say, that really was wrong. You admit it was wrong, and then you bring the offering so that when you confess your sin over the animal, it is with an actual sense of remorse. And they further expounded there in the Mechilta, in the Midrash collection, from any of the sins of man, that is, from that which is between him and his fellow, theft, robbery, and evil speech. Right? So Judaism often will talk about the distinction between sins between ourselves and God and between ourselves and other people. And sins between ourselves and other people are in many ways worse than sins between ourselves and God. Because when you sin against another person, you are also sinning against God. It's, buy one, get one free of things you shouldn't be doing. So therefore, this focus is trying to remind us of that severity. And this confession is truthfully requires that he return the theft that is in his hands, as if he does not do so, it would be better not to confess about it. Right? If you're just going to keep what you stole, then what is your confession? It is just empty words. It is not an actual admission of guilt. It is not a sign of regret, a sign of remorse, or a sign of change. It is just you're trying to get out of whatever the consequences have come to you for what you did. To rebel includes all those sentenced to death who must also confess, right? If you have been convicted of murder, you actually need to confess that you admit that what you did was wrong before your execution. That is part of how the execution is carried out. I might have thought to include even those convicted by false witnesses, meaning if you are a person who has been taken to court and false witnesses have risen against you and they have lied, you might think that you were supposed to confess too, because after all, you have been convicted. But that is even though those convicted by false witnesses, that is, even though he knows that he did not sin, except that the false testimony was testified against him, that he is obligated to confess about this. Hence, the verse teaches the soul that is guilty. I only said when there is guilt there, but not when he knows that he did not sin, except false testimony was testified against him. So basically, yes, if you actually didn't do something and you have been convicted because people have lied about it, then no, you do not need to confess to a sin you didn't commit. But to the sins that you did commit, yes, those you need to confess whether there has been evidence or not. In fact, it is always preferable to confess what you did and do tshuva before it has been brought against you in a formal sense, because this way it is truly from your heart rather than because your arm is being twisted. Hence, we understand that for all iniquities, large and small, even positive commandments, man is obligated to confess about them. The positive commandment reference means that if you fail to do something, right? If God asked you to, for example, do Kiddush for Friday night and you failed to do that, it is a different type of sin than doing something you're not supposed to. It is a sin of omission rather than commission. You omitted something rather than committed something. But even for things where you just forgot to do it, just chose not to do it, and you may have thought there was no harm, no problem, it's not such a big deal. Yes, even that you need to actually admit your mistake, in addition, of course, to trying to fix it for the future opportunities where you will do it. All right, we're going to pause there so I can just clear my throat and see if there are any questions.
I don't have a question, but I find it fascinating
Rabbi, I have
that.
Can you?
Oh, I'll Michelle first, and then my mother.
Oh, your mom first, Rabbi. Please.
All right, Michelle has given you the floor. So, but I lean into your mic. It's a little hard to hear you. Mom? Hello?
Did we lose her?
Okay,
well-
is it better now?
Yes, that's a little better.
Yes, better.
Yeah? Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Can you hear me or not?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
forget.
You're good. It's okay.
Oh, okay. I was thinking about all the people who are okay. I was thinking about all the people who are sent out of the camp, out of the big square. All
Mhm.
right. And then I'm thinking about how are they treated when they come back. Okay, they confess, they say, you know, they're sorry, they go into detail. I'm thinking of all the people. They have to do this in front of other people.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you keep from not having a bad reputation or being treated badly or no one ever trusts you again or back in with
Well,
love
yes.
and caring? I mean, it seems so hard.
Well, so
How
there are,
did they do that?
so there are a couple
That's,
things,
how did
right? There are a couple
they
things that
manage that?
So there are a couple of things that work in this process. One of them is, as you said, the person actually admits it. They show that they regret, they show contrition. And anybody who's ever had somebody honestly apologize to them knows that that is a very powerful thing to do. And people, of course, are commanded on the other side to accept a sincere apology and to accept somebody who comes back that is contrite. However, there is such a thing as your social reputation. And if you get into a pattern of committing crimes against other people and going out and coming back and confessing them and fixing it and then doing it again and doing it again and doing it again, yes, we always will accept you back in because we are commanded to accept you back in. Notice this is a two-way door. We're not sending people out and then not letting them return, right? They are allowed back in. But yes, people would still have to treat you with a minimum of dignity and respect. They wouldn't be allowed to harm you or take advantage of you. But I wouldn't be surprised if you're not getting invited around to people's house for tea, right? If people don't want to go in on business partnerships with you because you've cheated the last 5 partners you've had.
Oh my God.
Your reputation and standing in the community will, in the long term, be very, very important. This is one of the reasons why in the book of Proverbs, they say that a good name is more valuable than anything else, because your reputation will dictate how people will behave to you beyond the letter of the law. Yes, in the minimum, they're not taking revenge. They're not taking any sort of repercussions against you beyond what the judicial system gives. And they shouldn't be hating you. They should be treating you with respect. Even if you're their enemy, they help you in cases where the Torah tells them to help you, all of that. But don't expect anything better than that if you have repeatedly failed. So your own reputation was something that was very valuable and something that should be protected. And of course, the best way to protect it is to not do it in the first place. And having done it, to make a very clear and very powerful apology and restitution, fixing what the problem was, so that people recognize how committed you are to repairing the breach between you and them. But it's not easy, and it shouldn't be easy. We live nowadays in a society where apologies become sound bites.
Yes.
You just find YouTube channels, and if they make a mistake, they say something that's racist or terribly offensive. They go back on camera, they cry a little bit, they say, "Oh, it's so bad, please forgive me," and then they're back to their normal self.
Racist stuff, yeah.
Right, and we don't even take those apologies as being serious anymore. It's almost like just part of the game. But that's part of the problem of living in a very anonymous society where people are expendable and interchangeable, and no one sticks around in a relationship long enough to have a reputation that they've built up, that they are hoping will be able to be the currency of being in that community. And that's a great tragedy in our modern world. So it shouldn't be easy, but it is always possible.
Yeah.
And then that second part is very important, right? It is always possible, right? The person who worked for the KKK, the skinhead, whatever you want, going for current issues, when they decide to leave those organizations, when they decide to come back into the fold of humanity, they absolutely should be allowed to come back in and not continually reminded of their past sins, but instead, greeted as somebody who overcame the tragedy and the mistakes that they had made and recognized them from within the great mistakes and evil that they had committed. There always has to be a way for those people to come back into the camp through the process of actual tshuva, of really turning into a new direction. But yeah, it's not easy.
Another big example, talking about, the latest things that are going on, is, what happened to the General Michael Flynn. I mean, it's just the whole situation now. It's all unfolding, obviously, little by little, but it's coming out now that all these different things that he was accused was wrong. And, all of these different people were lashing and rawing against the guy. And it's just it's such a bad situation. And I thought that it was a great question what Charlene said, because it is so, I was thinking about the sacrifices as well. And I was thinking, well, we stood in line to bring the sacrifices, and depending on what we brought was our sin, and it's also another moment of embarrassment, but it's another moment of restitution. And at the same time, I'm glad that you're doing this. It's a recognition that a person is, putting himself above the circumstance and above whatever, situation they're in, and making themselves better. So I understand what you're talking about, Rabbi, in regards to being able to being a better person. So,
there are there's another level to the embarrassment of bringing your sacrifice, which is the sacrifice you bring is graded by what you're able to afford to bring. So if you're poor, you're bringing a smaller sacrifice as well than somebody who's wealthy. So that, for many people who are caught up on their status, will be another source of embarrassment. Of then, not only did they sin, but they can't even bring a flashy sacrifice.
That's correct. And that's interesting, but I'm glad that Charlene brought that point up, because it reminded me of that. And then what I wanted to say was that I think this class is amazing for such a time as this, for this moment and everything that is happening currently. And as a society, what we're going through, if there would have been some sort of restitution correction for example, the officer that happened, to Floyd, a few years ago, 10 years ago, this happened. If there would have been, that wouldn't have happened again. So it's interesting how we as a society, unfortunately, excuse me, will let certain things go, and but Torah is so wonderful at correcting things the best possible to keep us all in peace. It's just beautiful.
That was the point. I should also point out, although I'm not fully versed in all the details of the Flynn's case, from my understanding, he did actually confess to a number of crimes. And so that is a very important first step for his own tshuva, for the mistakes that he has admitted publicly and on legal record of having committed. Whatever else may be happening as that continues to go forward, I think it is important that we do recognize that he was willing to stand up in a court of law and say that, yes, he had committed numerous mistakes, numerous sins against our country. Let's move on. We have just a little bit more time and a little bit more to talk about, which is the holiday of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is, of course, considered the Day of Atonement when all of this comes to a head. Doesn't mean it's the only moment of atonement, but it is one that is extremely powerful. As you'll see from Sifra, the Midrash explains. From Leviticus, these different verses come. Only on the 10th day of the 7th month, it is a day of atonement, a holy calling for you, or shall it be for you, and you shall afflict your souls, and you shall present a fire offering to the Lord. The day of atonement, a holy calling, the day of atonement, and you shall afflict your souls. And all work you shall not do, for it is a day of atonement. All right. Enough already with the Day of Atonement, right? Why are there three different expressions and verses about this being the Day of Atonement? For I might think that Yom Kippur does not atone unless he made it a holy calling, afflicted himself and abstained from labor, right? Each of those things is mentioned together with the phrase Day of Atonement. If I had only had the one sentence, I might have thought that the Day of Atonement worked only if you did those three things. If you called it a holy gathering, which means in the tefillah, in our prayers, we use the proper phrasing. If we had afflicted ourselves, the fasting and other forms of self-limit on that day. And if we abstain from labor, of like Shabbat, of not engaging in any work on the day, it might have come to my mind that I have to do all three to give Yom Kippur its power. From whence do I derive that even if he did not do these, the day atones? From it is the day of atonement, right? It is not the day of doing the atoning things. It is the day of atonement. And on that day, you should also do these things. Well, I might think that Yom Kippur atoned then only with the offerings and with the he-goats that were offered through the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Whence do I derive that the day atones even without them, right? Even if I don't have the sacrifices, for example, in the modern world, from it is the day of atonement. It's not the day when we do the atoning sacrifices. It's the day of atonement on which we also do these sacrifices. However, the last point, I might think that it atones both for those who repent and those who do not. Right? No? Would this follow? A sin offering and a guilt offering atone. Just as they atone for penitence, as we saw from our section in the book of Numbers in Bamidbar, so Yom Kippur can only atone for the penitence, for people doing tshuva. So anybody who thinks there is a mechanical system for atonement in Judaism or in any theology is simply missing the point. If you want to make amends, if you want to fix yourself spiritually from the breach you have made between yourself and others and God, or just between yourself and God, depending upon what you have done, you have to actually confess it before anything gets better. You can do all the other stuff. Right? You can afflict yourself. You can do sacrifices. You can avoid doing the work. You can say all the right words. But if you don't actually confess, you don't actually repent from what you did, Yom Kippur has done nothing. It's just been a pageant, a show, a performance. And that has left you spiritually exactly where you were before the day began. And like I said before, too often, personally, communally, nationally, globally, we are really, really good at all of the pageant and show. And we're not usually so good on admitting our actual mistakes that have led to the problem over which we are making the show. We have to admit the mistakes that we've made, that, again, we or our communities or our nation or our world have made. And then all the other things we do will actually be useful for helping to bring about a full healing and a full spiritual transformation to move us in the right direction. Checking over on YouTube, checking back with the live folks. Any other questions or comments before we wrap it up for today? All righty then. I guess we will wrap it up for today.
Great class. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all for tuning in, and a special thanks to Michelle and my mother. I still can't call you by your first name. That just feels completely wrong. For speaking out and participating in the actual class. It definitely makes it better than just an hour of me talking. As much as I do appreciate, pointing to my YouTube chat over here, the comments and questions that come through YouTube sometimes, being able to do the give and take live is very, very important. And the Zoom link is the same every week. So if you see the link there, come next week and you can be live in the Zoom. You don't have to be trapped. You can even leave your camera off if you're afraid of people seeing. That's okay. But just remember, if we were doing this in person, we'd all be seeing you. So there's nothing to be embarrassed by. All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care, everyone. Be well.